Night presses down over the jungle like a heavy lid. Burma, late 1944. Monsoon rain still clings to the leaves, dripping steadily onto the darkened earth. The air is thick, wet soil, crushed vegetation, diesel, fuel barely masked. Somewhere beyond the tree line, Japanese listening posts remain silent, confident in the ground beneath them. Maps show nothing here. No roads, no paths capable of bearing weight. Only mud, roots, and steep, broken slopes that have swallowed men and animals for centuries. But the jungle is not asleep. Low engines murmur in disciplined intervals. Steel blades bite into earth. Trees fall not with explosions, but with controlled force, guided hands, and practiced precision. Floodlights remain covered. Work continues by touch, by instinct, by memory. Sweat mixes with rain. No one speaks loudly. There is no celebration in the labor, only urgency. By dawn, the ground has changed. Where there was once impassable terrain, a narrow but solid road stretches forward, its surface rough, wet, and unmistakably real. Trucks will roll here. Artillery will follow. Supplies will move faster than the defenders expect. When the mist lifts with the morning light, Japanese commanders will face a landscape their doctrine insisted could not exist. And in that moment, certainty begins to fracture, leading directly into how this war reached such a night. For decades before the Pacific War, terrain was not merely a feature of battle for the Imperial Japanese Army. It was a weapon. Japanese military planning in the interwar years placed extraordinary faith in geography. Mountains, jungles, rivers, and monsoon-soaked lowlands were seen as natural fortresses, barriers that could exhaust an enemy long before rifles or artillery were required. This belief was not theoretical. It was rooted in hard experience from campaigns in Manchuria and China, where poor roads, broken infrastructure, and vast distances slowed mechanized forces to a crawl. Infantry, accustomed to moving light and living off minimal supply, seemed better suited to such environments. By the late 1930s, this mindset had hardened into doctrine. Japanese field manuals emphasized mobility on foot, flexibility, and endurance over heavy transport. Engineers existed, but their role was limited. Roads were useful, but not essential. In jungle or mountain warfare, the assumption was simple. Large-scale mechanized movement would be impossible. Any enemy attempting it would be slowed, exposed, and ultimately defeated by terrain before decisive contact even occurred. When war expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific after 1941, early victories appear to confirm these beliefs. British and Dutch forces in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies relied on established road networks. Once those were cut or bypassed, their positions collapsed. In Burma, Allied units struggled against heat, disease, and mud as much as against Japanese troops. Vehicles bogged down. Supply lines fractured. Entire offensives stalled, not because of enemy fire, but because nothing could move fast enough to sustain them. These experiences reinforced Japanese confidence. The jungle was an ally. Road construction, in Japanese thinking, was slow, labor-intensive, and vulnerable. It required time, heavy equipment, and large supply columns, luxuries presumed unavailable under combat conditions. Night construction was especially dismissed as unrealistic. Without air superiority, without secure rear areas, and without established infrastructure, building functional roads in contested jungle zones seemed implausible. As a result, Japanese defensive planning often relied on what maps did not show. Positions were placed behind rivers, deep in forests, or beyond steep ridgelines, assuming the ground itself would delay or channel any attacker. Supply calculations assumed the enemy would be forced onto narrow paths, dependent on porters or animals, limited in artillery and armored support. Speed of advance was expected to be measured in miles per week, not per day. But this doctrine carried a hidden risk. It assumed that the enemy shared the same limitations. Early Allied campaigns did, in fact, struggle with engineering. British and Indian forces in Burma lacked sufficient heavy equipment. American units arriving in 1942 and 1943 faced steep learning curves in jungle operations. Bulldozers were scarce. Roads, where they existed, were narrow, fragile, and easily destroyed by rain. Japanese forces repeatedly outmaneuvered opponents by exploiting these weaknesses. Yet even as these early failures unfolded, a different approach was forming elsewhere. In Washington and London, the war was increasingly understood not just as a contest of armies, but of systems. Factories, logistics, transportation, and engineering were becoming as decisive as infantry tactics. The United States, in particular, viewed terrain not as a fixed constraint, but as a problem to be solved. This difference in perspective would soon matter. By 1943, Allied command structures in the China, Burma, India theater began reassessing their assumptions. If the jungle prevented movement, then the jungle needed to be altered. If mountains blocked supply, then roads had to climb them. Speed would no longer be achieved by marching light, but by building fast. What Japanese planners continued to see as an impassable environment was about to become a workspace. And as this shift took shape, the foundations were laid for a kind of warfare that did not rely on surprise attacks or elite infantry alone, but on engineers working through the night, changing the ground itself. The shift did not begin at the front. It began in factories, training grounds, and planning rooms thousands of miles away from the jungle. By 1943, Allied leadership, particularly within the United States Army, had reached a hard conclusion. Modern war could not be sustained by courage and improvisation alone. It required systems, and among those systems, engineering stood near the center. Unlike the Japanese Army, which prioritized infantry mobility and accepted environmental limits, American doctrine treated terrain as a variable. Roads, airstrips, bridges, and ports were not conveniences. They were weapons. If they did not exist, they would be built. If they were destroyed, they would be rebuilt, often faster than the enemy believed possible. This philosophy produced organizations specifically designed for construction under fire. U.S. Army Engineer combat battalions were expanded and retrained. Naval construction battalions, soon known as the Seabees, were formed in 1942 with a simple mandate: build and fight. Their personnel were drawn from civilian trades: construction foremen, heavy equipment operators, electricians, carpenters, men who had spent years shaping landscapes with machines. They were given uniforms, rifles, and a mission that did not end when shooting began. Crucially, they were also given equipment. Bulldozers, graders, dump trucks, and portable sawmills were shipped in numbers no other army could match. American industry did not merely produce tanks and aircraft. It produced earth-moving machines by the tens of thousands. These machines were standardized, rugged, and designed to be repaired in the field. Spare parts followed behind them as faithfully as ammunition. In the China, Burma, India theater, this capability arrived at a moment of necessity. Allied forces faced immense logistical challenges. There were no reliable ports deep inland. Railways were limited or destroyed. The famous supply line into China had already been severed. Every advance risked outrunning its own food, fuel, and medical support. Without roads, there could be no sustained pressure, only isolated thrusts that withered in the jungle. Commanders like General Joseph Stilwell understood the stakes. His forces could not defeat Japanese positions by maneuver alone if they remained dependent on foot supply. Roads were no longer optional. They were decisive. What followed was a doctrinal shift that Japanese intelligence largely missed. Engineering units were integrated into operational planning from the outset. Construction schedules were synchronized with combat movements. Routes were selected not for ease, but for surprise. Engineers trained to work at night under blackout conditions, often within artillery range of the enemy. Noise discipline became as important as speed. Trees were felled in controlled directions. Earth was compacted while still wet. Drainage ditches were cut immediately to prevent monsoon collapse. Most importantly, time was compressed. Where traditional road building might take weeks, Allied engineers learned to produce usable, if imperfect, roads in hours. These are not finished highways. They were narrow, muddy, and temporary, but they could support trucks. They could carry artillery. And once traffic began flowing, they could be reinforced, widened, and improved. This speed changed operational reality. Japanese defensive calculations assumed long delays between Allied movements. They expected time to reposition, reinforce, or counterattack. But when roads appeared overnight, those assumptions failed. Supply columns arrived earlier than expected. Artillery followed infantry instead of lagging behind. Units thought to be isolated suddenly had logistical depth. Reports from the field began to note something unsettling. Allied forces were no longer slowed primarily by terrain. They were slowed only by how fast engineers could work. And engineers were learning to work very fast. By late 1944, this capability had matured. Bulldozers were pushed to the edge of forward positions. Engineer officers coordinated directly with infantry commanders. Maps were redrawn not to reflect existing roads, but planned ones. The ground itself was becoming provisional, and as Allied advances pressed deeper into areas once considered naturally secure, Japanese commanders began encountering a new and disorienting reality. Defensive positions that relied on impassable approaches were suddenly vulnerable. The jungle was no longer protection. It was material, something the enemy could cut, shape, and cross. This realization would not come all at once. It would arrive at night, in rain, with the sound of engines where none were supposed to be. And from that point forward, the war would be fought not just over terrain, but over who could remake it faster. The engineers rarely appeared in victory photographs. They worked at the edges of maps, often beyond the range of formal recognition, measuring success not in ground taken, but in ground transformed. Many were older than the infantry they supported. Some had left civilian construction jobs only months earlier. Highway crews, quarry operators, machine mechanics. In Burma and the Western Pacific, they labored in conditions that punished the body relentlessly. Work began when others dug in for the night. Under blackout conditions, with floodlights masked or entirely absent, crews operated by muscle memory and whispered commands. Rain soaked uniforms within minutes. Leeches clung to exposed skin. Malaria and dysentery were constant threats. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by artillery fire or air alerts. Yet schedules did not change. If infantry planned to move at dawn, a road had to exist by dawn. There was little room for error. A misjudged slope could bog a truck. Poor drainage could erase hours of work in a single downpour. Every decision, where to cut, where to fill, how much weight the soil could bear, had immediate consequences. Engineers carried rifles, but their primary defense was speed. The faster the road appeared, the less time the enemy had to react. For frontline commanders, these roads altered everything. Operations that once required weeks of preparation could be launched with days' notice. Artillery no longer lagged far behind advancing infantry. Ammunition, food, and medical evacuation flowed with a consistency previously unimaginable in jungle warfare. Units could maneuver laterally, not just forward, allowing flanking movements where Japanese planners expected frontal assaults along narrow paths. This mobility created asymmetry. Japanese units, trained to move light and live off limited supply, found themselves facing opponents who could concentrate firepower quickly and sustain it. Defensive positions carefully sited behind rivers or ridgelines lost value when the enemy could simply approach from a different axis. What mattered was no longer how difficult the ground was, but how fast it could be altered. Roads also compressed time. Japanese commanders often expected pauses between Allied advances, periods when supply caught up and formations reorganized. Overnight road construction eliminated those pauses. Pressure became continuous. Units defending remote positions began to feel pursued rather than opposed, as if the ground itself were closing in on them. There are no reliable records of dramatic exclamations or shouted disbelief. Japanese shock appeared instead in reports, redeployments, and altered tactics. Intelligence summaries noted Allied movement rates exceeding previous estimates. Defensive lines were repositioned farther back. Supply dumps were moved, then moved again as roads negated earlier assumptions of isolation. What unsettled Japanese commanders was not merely the presence of roads, but their timing. Roads appeared where reconnaissance had reported none only hours earlier. Positions thought safe until the dry season suddenly faced truck-borne artillery in the rain. Counterattacks planned along narrow approaches found themselves flanked by forces that should not have been able to arrive so quickly. This challenged core beliefs. Japanese doctrine accepted hardship and limited supply as universal constraints. The idea that an enemy could overcome terrain through sheer industrial and organizational capacity contradicted deeply held assumptions about warfare in Asia. It suggested that endurance and familiarity with the environment were no longer decisive advantages. Instead, the initiative shifted to whoever could mobilize resources fastest. As these realizations accumulated, Japanese units adapted where they could, improving camouflage, dispersing positions, relying more heavily on ambush. But adaptation had limits. Engineers could change the shape of the battlefield faster than doctrine could change expectations. By late 1944, the psychological effect was unmistakable. Terrain, once a trusted ally, could no longer be relied upon. Jungle, mountain, and mud were no longer sufficient barriers. The enemy did not merely traverse them. He remade them. And behind this transformation stood not a single weapon or commander, but a system that fused human labor, tactical foresight, and industrial power into something the Japanese army had never fully prepared to confront. This realization did not end the fighting, but it altered how the war was experienced by those on the ground, leading directly into deeper questions about technology, leadership, and the moral weight of building as a method of destruction. The bulldozer became one of the most influential weapons of the campaign, though it fired no shot. American engineering units arrived with machines specifically designed for punishment. Track bulldozers could move where wheeled vehicles failed, spreading weight across mud and soft ground. Graders followed to smooth surfaces just enough for trucks to pass. Portable sawmills reduced fallen trees into usable planks within hours. Steel matting could be laid across weak ground, allowing immediate use before permanent reinforcement. These machines did more than speed construction. They imposed predictability on chaos. Rain no longer meant paralysis. Hills no longer dictated approach. What mattered was fuel, spare parts, and trained operators. With those in place, the jungle became a series of tasks rather than an obstacle. Japanese forces possessed engineering units, but not at this scale. Fuel shortages limited machine use. Equipment was lighter, scarcer, and often reserved for rear areas. The contrast became stark as Allied machines appeared closer to the front, sometimes within sight of contested ground. Technology altered sound as well as sight. Engines could be heard at night where silence once reigned. The jungle, long considered concealment, now amplified unfamiliar mechanical noise. Even when positions were not directly threatened, the presence of machines signaled something worse: inevitability. This transformation did not occur accidentally. It was driven by commanders who understood that engineering was not support. it was strategy. Allied operational planning increasingly treated roads as objectives in their own right. Before infantry moved, engineers were tasked with enabling that movement. Timelines were drawn backward from desired outcomes, allocating hours, not days, for construction. Leadership also accepted risk. Bulldozers and graders were valuable assets, vulnerable to artillery and air attack. Pushing them forward required confidence that speed would offset exposure. Commanders had to trust engineers to work under pressure and trust infantry to protect them when necessary. This integration blurred traditional boundaries between combat and support roles. Japanese leadership, by contrast, often faced constraints beyond doctrine. Industrial limitations restricted heavy equipment production. Shipping shortages prioritized weapons and ammunition. Even when commanders recognized the changing nature of the battlefield, they lacked the means to respond symmetrically. The result was an increasing mismatch between intent and capability. Leadership decisions thus compounded technological gaps. Roads are usually associated with connection and development. In wartime Burma and the Pacific, they became instruments of destruction. Each road enabled deeper penetration, heavier firepower, and sustained pressure on positions that had once relied on isolation for survival. For Japanese defenders, the appearance of a road often signaled not just impending contact, but prolonged engagement without relief. For engineers, this carried moral weight. They were not neutral builders. Every cut through the jungle facilitated combat. Every bridge carried shells and fuel. Many understood this clearly. Letters and diaries describe pride and efficiency alongside unease at consequences. Building was not an abstract act. It had immediate human cost. Yet within the logic of total war, there was no separation. To build was to fight. This reality reshaped how warfare was understood. Victory no longer depended solely on battlefield brilliance or individual valor. It depended on who could mobilize labor, machines, and organization to change reality faster than the enemy could respond. By the time Japanese commanders fully grasped this shift, its effects were already embedded in the ground beneath their feet. Roads were no longer anomalies. They were expected, planned, relentless. And in one operation in particular, this new form of warfare reached a decisive point, when an overnight road did not merely surprise the enemy, but unraveled an entire defensive scheme. That moment would mark the transition from adaptation to inevitability. Northern Burma, December 1944. The campaign had entered a phase where patience mattered as much as pressure. Japanese forces, already stretched thin, relied heavily on the last remaining advantages of terrain. Steep ridgelines, dense jungle corridors, and narrow valleys still shaped their defensive plans. Intelligence estimates assumed that any major Allied movement would require extended preparation. There would be signs. There would be time. On paper, the ground ahead was impassable. The objective lay beyond a tangle of forested hills, cut by streams that swelled with every rainfall. No existing road connected the Allied forward positions to this sector. Japanese commanders assessed the area as secure against rapid approach. Patrols were limited. Heavy weapons were positioned to cover known paths, not hypothetical ones. The Allied plan did not follow the map. In late December, U.S. Army engineers attached to advancing units received orders that did not specify weeks or even days. The directive was measured in hours. A supply route had to exist by morning, sufficient for trucks, artillery, and continuous traffic. The approach would be indirect, avoiding obvious terrain features that the enemy monitored. Work began after nightfall. Bulldozers moved forward in staggered intervals, engines throttled low. Infantry screens pushed ahead and to the flanks, listening as much as watching. Trees were felled carefully, angled to avoid unnecessary noise. Earth was cut and packed while still saturated, creating a base that would harden under weight rather than dissolve. Rain complicated everything. Streams overflowed their banks. Clay soil threatened to collapse back into cuts. Engineers adapted in real time, diverting water, laying corduroy sections from logs, reinforcing weak points with scrap steel and rock. There was no blueprint beyond experience and urgency. By midnight, the route existed in fragments. By 0300 hours, those fragments were joined. Trucks waited with engines off, crews sleeping beside their vehicles. Artillery units stood ready, guns already oriented. At first light, movement would begin. If the road failed, the operation would stall in full view of the enemy. It did not fail. At dawn, Allied vehicles rolled forward through ground Japanese planners believed could not support them. The sound reached defensive positions before the sight did. Engines where silence was expected. Observers reported movement on axes previously considered inaccessible. Within hours, artillery was in position, range tables calculated for targets that had not been considered threatened. Japanese responses were delayed, not from indecision, but from disbelief colliding with reality. Orders to reposition units required time. Supply columns could not match the pace of Allied movement. Positions sited to block narrow approaches suddenly faced pressure from unexpected directions. The defensive geometry collapsed unevenly, creating gaps that widened as the day progressed. This was not a single dramatic breakthrough. It was a systemic failure. The overnight road did more than enable an advance. It invalidated assumptions that had governed months of planning. Terrain no longer dictated tempo. The enemy controlled time. Reports filed later noted the speed of Allied logistics as a decisive factor. Not tanks, not airstrikes. Movement, sustained, organized movement through ground thought to be prohibitive. As Japanese units attempted to regroup, the road expanded. Engineers widened sections under daylight. Drainage improved. Traffic increased. What had been a fragile lifeline at dawn became a reliable artery by afternoon. Each passing hour compounded the initial shock. By nightfall, Japanese commanders faced a choice they had hoped terrain would spare them. Fight without the protection of distance, or withdraw into a shrinking interior where roads would follow again. The moment marked more than a tactical setback. It signaled that the environment itself could no longer be trusted as a defense. The war had entered a phase where the ground changed faster than plans. And as this realization spread along the front, the consequences would deepen, reshaping not just one battle, but the conduct of the campaign itself. The effect of the road did not peak at first contact. It accelerated. Once traffic began flowing, every assumption the Japanese command had made about tempo unraveled. Allied columns moved not in cautious probes, but in sustained waves, supplies first, then guns, then additional infantry. What should have taken days of preparation unfolded within a single operational cycle. Morning reconnaissance reports were obsolete by afternoon. Japanese forward units reported pressure from directions that maps still marked as jungle. Artillery fire followed soon after, not sporadic but methodical, calibrated by observers who had reached vantage points previously considered unreachable. Fire plans adjusted hourly. The defenders were no longer reacting to attacks along expected corridors. They were reacting to a system that continuously expanded its own reach. Attempts to counter the road proved costly. Small Japanese detachments moved to interdict construction points, but they arrived late. Engineers worked under infantry cover now, with machine guns positioned to secure critical bends and cuttings. Air support, once delayed by distance, could now operate closer to the front thanks to the same infrastructure logic, temporary strips, and improved supply routes feeding forward positions. The road became self-protecting. Every truck that passed reinforced its importance. Every gun placed along it increased the cost of interference. The Japanese army, already constrained by limited transport and fuel shortages, could not match this escalation. Counterattacks relied on foot movement through terrain that now favored the attacker. Command decisions grew narrower. With lateral movement compromised and withdrawal routes threatened, Japanese commanders faced a dilemma: hold ground that no longer offered protection, or abandon positions to avoid encirclement. Neither option preserved cohesion. Units that withdrew did so under pressure, often leaving equipment behind. Units that held faced sustained bombardment without the relief terrain had once promised. Reports from headquarters reflected a shift in language. Terrain was no longer described as defensive. It was described as penetrated. Movement rates were recalculated upward for Allied forces. Requests for reinforcements acknowledged delays that could no longer be absorbed. The road had shortened distance not just physically, but operationally. By the third day, the outcome was clear. The initial overnight construction had not been a gamble. It had been the opening move of an irreversible process. Once engineers established a foothold, expansion followed inevitably. Additional routes branched off. Supply capacity increased. Flexibility multiplied. The battlefield ceased to be a static space and became a fluid network. Japanese units began falling back to positions that relied less on terrain and more on proximity to remaining supply hubs. But those hubs were now reachable. Each withdrawal bought time, but less than before. The ground no longer slowed the enemy enough to reset the balance. What distinguished this turning point from earlier advances was not scale, but certainty. There was no single dramatic collapse. No encirclement celebrated in headlines. Instead, there was a quiet recognition spreading through command channels that the nature of the war had changed permanently. Engineering speed had surpassed defensive depth. From this point forward, Japanese planning could no longer assume that jungle, hills, or rain would dictate Allied movement. Every position had to be defended as if roads might appear overnight, because they could, and they did. Subsequent advances followed the same pattern. Engineers pushed forward early. Infantry secured perimeters. Roads emerged in stages, often under fire. Each time, the effect compounded. What had once been shocking became expected, but no less damaging. By early 1945, the strategic implications were undeniable. The Allies did not merely advance through hostile terrain. They erased its advantages. The Japanese army, built around endurance and adaptation to environment, found itself confronting an opponent who treated environment as raw material. The turning point, marked by that first night of construction, was not about surprise alone. It was about inevitability. And when inevitability enters a war, the aftermath unfolds not in moments, but in consequences that reshape everything that follows. The road did not disappear when the battle moved on. It remained, scarred by traffic, widened by use, and reinforced by necessity. What began as a narrow overnight route quickly became a permanent feature of the campaign, altering how every subsequent operation in the sector was conducted. For Allied forces, the change was immediate and measurable. Supply delivery times dropped. Medical evacuation accelerated. Artillery ammunition could be stockpiled rather than rationed by distance. For Japanese units still in contact, the effect was corrosive. Positions that once relied on isolation now faced continuous pressure. Without the expectation of natural pauses imposed by terrain, defenders experienced a form of operational exhaustion. There was less time to regroup, fewer opportunities to rebuild defenses, and no reliable sense of when the next movement might occur. Even quiet nights carried the possibility of engines starting in the dark. Intelligence assessments shifted accordingly. Japanese reports began to emphasize Allied logistical capability rather than troop numbers. The presence of engineer units near the front was treated as a warning sign equal to the arrival of armor or artillery. Where bulldozers appeared, movement was expected to follow. This recognition came too late to restore balance, but it altered priorities. Defensive works were adapted. Camouflage improved. Positions were dispersed to reduce vulnerability once roads allowed heavier firepower forward. Emphasis shifted toward ambush and delay rather than static defense. Yet these adaptations operated within shrinking margins. Without comparable engineering capacity, Japanese forces could not control where the enemy chose to build. The psychological effect extended beyond immediate contact zones. Commanders farther back adjusted expectations preemptively, abandoning reliance on terrain once considered secure. Supply dumps were moved deeper or broken into smaller caches. Routes of withdrawal were planned with greater urgency. Each adjustment reflected a loss of confidence in geography as protection. Allied command, by contrast, doubled down. Engineer battalions received increased priority for fuel and equipment. Road building was planned not just to support current advances, but to enable future ones. What had proven effective once became standard procedure. The presence of engineers at the planning table was no longer debated. This had cascading effects. Air support benefited from improved ground access. Forward observers could be supplied and rotated more effectively. Casualty evacuation reduced long-term losses by shortening time to treatment. These advantages reinforced each other, creating momentum that terrain alone could not counter. Japanese countermeasures struggled to keep pace. Sabotage efforts against roads achieved temporary disruptions, but rarely halted movement for long. Repairs were often completed within hours. The labor and material imbalance was stark. Destroying a section of road cost the defender significant effort. Rebuilding it cost the attacker less each time. By early 1945, the operational pattern was clear. Where engineers led, advances followed. Where roads existed, Japanese resistance weakened sooner. The overnight road that once shocked commanders had become a template, quiet, efficient, and devastating in its cumulative effect. The immediate aftermath was not marked by dramatic surrender or collapse. It was marked by inevitability taking root. And as campaigns progressed, the consequences of this shift extended beyond individual battles, reshaping strategy at the highest levels and redefining what modern warfare demanded from those who planned it. As the campaign advanced into its final months, the road ceased to be remarkable. That in itself was the most telling outcome. What had once produced shock now produced expectation. Allied planning assumed that terrain could be reshaped quickly enough to support momentum. Japanese planning assumed the opposite, that any position, no matter how remote, might soon be accessible. This shift altered strategy on both sides. For the Allies, engineering capacity became a measure of operational reach. Decisions about where to advance were increasingly influenced by how fast roads could be built, not by where they already existed. This flexibility allowed commanders to bypass heavily defended areas and apply pressure where resistance was weakest. The battlefield became less about fixed lines and more about networks, routes, nodes, and flow. For the Japanese army, the consequences were constricting. Defensive depth, once provided by terrain, eroded. Without the ability to relocate heavy equipment or sustain supply under pressure, Japanese forces faced a narrowing set of options. Withdrawals became more frequent, but also more costly, as roads allowed pursuit. Each fallback position offered diminishing returns. The imbalance extended beyond tactics. Industrial capacity now expressed itself directly on the battlefield. The ability to manufacture, transport, and maintain earth-moving machinery translated into combat power. Roads enabled everything that followed. Artillery concentration, airfield construction, sustained infantry presence. The connection between factory output and frontline outcome became visible in the dirt beneath advancing columns. This had doctrinal implications. Post-war analyses would note that engineering was no longer auxiliary. It was central. The campaigns demonstrated that logistics and construction could dictate tempo as decisively as enemy resistance. Terrain, once considered a constant, was revealed as temporary. For Japanese commanders who survived the war, this realization carried bitter clarity. Their army had prepared to endure hardship, to adapt to environment, and to fight light. It had not prepared to contest an enemy who could afford to change the environment itself. The jungle had been an ally until it wasn't. By the time hostilities ended, roads crisscrossed regions once thought unreachable. Some would later serve civilian purposes. Others would vanish back into vegetation. But during the war, their impact was unmistakable. They shortened distance. They multiplied force. They removed uncertainty. The overnight road, built under rain and darkness, became a symbol of a broader truth. Wars are not decided solely by bravery or brilliance. They're decided by who can organize effort at scale and sustain it under pressure. This truth would shape military thinking long after the last shots were fired. And as the machinery fell silent and the jungle slowly reclaimed its ground, the meaning of those roads remained, leading into a final reflection on what this episode revealed about power, preparation, and the hidden forces that decide history. War is often imagined in moments of confrontation, blazing artillery, charges across open fields, hand-to-hand combat. Yet in northern Burma and the jungles of the Pacific, the decisive moments were quieter, slower, and less visible. They took shape not in the roar of battle, but in the persistent hum of engines cutting through mud, the scrape of steel on earth, and the tireless hands of men shaping ground that had once seemed immovable. The overnight road was more than a path for trucks and guns. It was a manifestation of preparation, foresight, and the industrial power that underpinned modern warfare. It demonstrated that control of terrain is not absolute. Nature can be transformed, obstacles overcome, and the assumptions of commanders, no matter how confident, rendered obsolete. For the Japanese, the road was a shock not because it was fast, but because it was possible, a possibility they had systematically dismissed. This episode illuminates a broader truth about conflict. The invisible elements often determine outcomes. Strategy is not measured only in tactical brilliance, but in the capacity to organize, to sustain, and to adapt. Engineers, machines, and logistics, elements that rarely make headlines, can become the force that reshapes the battlefield. In this case, human ingenuity and coordination turn night into day, mud into mobility, and impossibility into inevitability. In the quiet aftermath, as the jungle slowly reclaimed the scars of war, the significance of those roads remained. They were a reminder that victory can be built as much as it can be fought, that preparation, labor, and foresight may carry consequences equal to any artillery barrage, and that in the vast, green expanse of conflict, the true measure of power often lies not in the weapons held, but in the ability to change the ground itself. The overnight road stands as a testament to this principle, a subtle, uncelebrated, yet decisive force in the history of World War II, and a lesson in how the most transformative victories are often forged quietly before dawn.